Hello everybody, I hope the day is finding you well, and if everything went according to plan, then you are listening to this, hopefully, Wednesday afternoon. For you see, this little Lore After Hours review is a discussion on the subject of the last, 10 days of flavor text of the day. That is, the Seer's Parables, and more broadly, the Lorwyn block story, the Lorwyn Shadowmoor story, which I have greatly enjoyed for basically as long as I've known about it. Let's dive right in with the Seer's Parables itself, and then we'll, branch out into the larger story. As a brief overview, the Seer's Parables were written by Rei Nakazawa back in 2008, for a segment of the Wizards of the Coast articles called Savor the Flavor, which were little addendums, little additions to the lore articles at the time, and they were always very fun to read, and I think Nakazawa does a good job with this story as well, because it is a story. It's an anthology of sorts, a collection of stories. The parables tell of a Kithkin who visits a Kithkin seer, asking how the world will end. And while the seer initially is reluctant to answer that question, saying that the Kithkin will not like what he hears, the seer does answer his following questions in gory detail. The parables describe a series of godlike or demigod-like figures that exist on the plane of Lorwyn and are incomprehensibly powerful. They rend reality with their might. They view the world from beyond the horizon. They are unstoppable monsters and basically unassailable gods. They are crazy to think about. I mean, of all the creatures we've encountered with Magic the Gathering's lore over the decades, this is a group of creatures we know quite a bit about, but also very little about. You see, I'm always curious when it comes to these creatures' place in Lorwyn's hierarchy. For those of you who don't know, Una, the Queen of the Fae, is described in the Lorwyn Shadowmoor novels as sort of the overseer, the master, the mistress of Lorwyn. Her will guides the great aurora, shapes it and changes the world, and her will alone protect the fairies from the effects of the great aurora. We are introduced to a few other great elementals, the source of the river and the fire elemental of Ashling respectively, but we don't really get to see these creatures, these demigods, in the Lorwyn story, and it's something I'm very curious about. Where does Una fall in relation to them? Is she a member of this class of demigods, or is Una something else entirely? Are these demigods stronger than Una? If so, why have they not challenged her might and her authority over Lorwyn? And, more importantly, do these demigods actually exist in the context of the story, or are they fictional within the fictional world of Lorwyn? For that last question, I can say with some clarity, some certainty at least, that the answer is no, that within Lorwyn itself these demigods are real, because, as you may or may not be aware by now, the seer herself turns out to be one of these demigods, and she imparts the Kithkin with way too much knowledge that threatens to drive him into utter insanity. But even though one of them is definitely real, perhaps the other 9 that we hear of, that we see on the cards, are fictional. It's hard to say when they never have a larger presence in the story, and they don't even appear later on in Lorwyn's story itself, or any of the other fiction that takes place on Lorwyn, at least not to my knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something where they pop in and play a role, but to the best of my knowledge, they never show up, they never have a hand in the plot of Lorwyn, Shadowmoor, any of the stories on it, or even when the Phyrexians invade it during March of the Machines. And that's kind of sad, because I would absolutely love to see these great unknowable demigods absolutely wrecking some Phyrexian shit, It'd just be a cool thing to see. Anywho, The Seer's Parables, like I said, it's a good story. It's a brief one. There's 10 sub-chapters to it, and they're all quite enjoyable to read. It's kind of apocryphal in a way, that's telling a story of a story. What's the word for that? The Canterbury Tales does the same thing, where it's a story within a story. I forget what it's called. I'm sure someone in the comment section is going to yell at me about it, because it's like something you learn in 5th grade or something. Whatever. Moving on to the broader Lorwyn story. I've said it before, and I'll say it again as many times as I need to. The Lorwyn Shadowmoor block is probably one of my absolute favorite entries into the Magic the Gathering lore. I love the characters, I love the world, I love the progression of the plot, and I love Aisling. In case you weren't aware, Aisling is one of my favorite characters in Magic the Gathering, period, and I would absolutely love to have seen more of her. But she's not the only one. I enjoyed Rhys and the fact that he was hilariously racist, yet also decidedly clueless about his entire role and all the events going on around him. I loved the mystery of Marilyn. I hated Bridget, but I enjoyed, the fairies that hung around with them, the captain whose name I'm forgetting right now. What was his name? Crap. I think it might have been Sig. I can't be sure. There's a legendary merfolk named Sig, so maybe I'm just misremembering him as the merfolk captain from the story, but it doesn't matter. I enjoyed these characters, I enjoyed their quest, and even the bittersweet ending of it. The Lorwyn Shadowmoor story has one of the more somber endings in Magic the Gathering. I'm not going to spoil it here for you all, because I'm going to probably end up talking about it in another video later. So you can either wait for that video, or you can go out and read the story yourself. That's right, I'm advertising that you go read the books, boys. It's a good plot. And you know what? It's also the only plot. There's not a whole lot to Lorwyn Shadowmoor. You see, we get a lot of the world in flavor texts. We get 4 books, 3 main stories and 1 anthology book. We get a few side stories of the world itself. And that's kind of it. We get very little of Lorwyn Shadowmoor, which I think is an absolute shame, since it's probably the most interesting world Wizards of the Coast has ever created. People like to say, oh, well, there's no humans there, so how can we relate? And I say, good, there's humans on every world. They don't all need humans, and you don't need humans to relate to the characters going on in the plot. You don't have to be represented one-to-one perfectly by the characters in the story to empathize with them. I empathize greatly with Rhys, because he's a dude who made a very terrible mistake and tried rectifying it, but in the end couldn't. I empathized with Aisling, someone who was horribly wronged and was feeling angry and vengeful. And I'd love to say I empathize with Bridget, but I fucking hate Bridget. She's awful. But yeah, if you're like me and you enjoy more whimsical, soft magic fantasy, I think you'll really, really enjoy the Lorwyn story as it's presented. And, I can always hope that we'll get more of Lorwyn in the future, but at the same time, with how Wizards handles their story, with how they handle their game, I'm not really enthusiastic about the idea of them returning to Lorwyn anytime in the near future. All I can hope for is that if we do go back, it'll be a good return, Not like what they did to Kamigawa. Anywho, that's really all I've got for you. Just wanted to say, I absolutely love Lorwyn, I love the characters, and I really enjoyed the Seer's Parables. I hope you guys enjoyed them too, as we covered them on the channel. If you ever have suggestions for things for me to cover on Flavor Text of the Day, you can recommend it in the comment section, or you can go ahead and visit us over on Discord. There's a whole channel dedicated exclusively to Flavor Text of the Day recommendations, and it is pretty much constantly bombarded with recommendations. I love it. Talk to you guys later. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.